Chapter 1. The Return Home. Maggie Winters gripped the steering wheel tighter as the faded "Welcome to Haven Bay" sign came into view. Its chipped paint and leaning stance were exactly as she remembered, a crooked gate to a place she had sworn never to return. 10 years had passed since she last drove these winding roads, and every mile she'd traveled from Boston back to this sleepy coastal town had chipped away at her carefully constructed wall of detachment. It wasn't grief that brought her back. Not exactly. Her grandfather's death had been expected. He was nearing 90 and had been slowing down for years. What made her return now was obligation. Legal papers, a property to settle, and a lighthouse, old, weathered, and practically forgotten, that now bore her name on its deed. The town stretched quietly ahead. December had draped Haven Bay in a soft gray hush. Snow clung gently to rooftops and lined the narrow sidewalks where Maggie once played hopscotch with the neighbor kids. Some of the shops on Main Street still stood: the bakery with the blue awning, the bookstore where her mother had read her stories. Others had changed, renamed, or shuttered, ghosts of a simpler time. Maggie pulled her car into the gravel driveway beside the Lighthouse cottage and killed the engine. The silence settled around her like a sigh. She stared up at the tower. It loomed, just like it had in her childhood memories, its once white exterior now faded and chipped, windows clouded with time. The iron railing at the top rusted like dried blood. The place looked tired, like it had been holding its breath since the day she left. Dragging her suitcase from the trunk, she hesitated on the porch. The key trembled slightly in her hand. Behind this door was her past, pressed into every wall and floorboard, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She turned the key. The cottage smelled of dust and old wood. It was quiet, save for the soft creak of the door and her own boots on the hardwood floor. Nothing had changed. The same plaid couch in the living room. The old quilt her grandmother made draped over the armchair. A photograph of her younger self with her grandfather fishing, still perched on the mantel. Her eyes stung. Maggie set her suitcase by the door and stood in the center of the room. "Just a few days," she muttered. "Sort through the paperwork, get a realtor, and get back to Boston." But the weight of the place said otherwise. It clung to her coat and hair like sea salt, the kind you couldn't wash out, no matter how far you ran. She wandered into the kitchen, opened a cupboard, and smiled faintly. The same chipped blue mugs were still there. Her grandfather's collection of mismatched plates. A stack of unopened mail sat on the counter, carefully sorted. She didn't recognize most of the return addresses, but one envelope caught her eye. It had been postmarked only a few weeks before his death. She tucked it into her coat pocket without thinking. Outside, the wind howled against the windows, and the scent of sea air pushed through the cracks. Maggie crossed to the lighthouse entrance and unlocked the old door with a rusted key labeled Tower. The hinges groaned as she stepped inside. The lighthouse interior was cold and dark, its stone walls damp with coastal chill. A narrow spiral staircase wound upward, cloaked in dust and cobwebs. She slowly ascended, one step at a time, her footsteps echoing with each creak. The air changed as she reached the top. Thinner, colder, but somehow clearer. The lamp room offered a panoramic view of the coast. Maggie gazed out, watching waves crash against the jagged rocks far below. Her breath fogged the glass. There, in the distance, the town's harbor lights twinkled like a string of stars tossed across the water. The ocean had always been both her comfort and her curse, vast and beautiful, but capable of sweeping everything away. She turned from the view and spotted a dust-covered box in the corner of the lamp room. It was labeled, "For M." Her heartbeat stumbled. She crouched, opened it slowly, and found a snow globe inside, the very one her grandfather had given her when she was 9. A tiny replica of the lighthouse sat inside, surrounded by swirling glitter and snow. Etched on the wooden base were the words, "Light always finds its way home." She set it down gently, afraid it might break from the weight of her memories. The wind howled louder, rattling the glass panes around her. For a moment, it felt like the lighthouse itself was breathing, remembering her, calling her by name. She drew her coat tighter and descended the stairs, trying to steady her thoughts. She had told herself this trip was just about logistics. Closure. But Haven Bay didn't care about her timeline. It had waited, patient and persistent, like the tide. Back inside the cottage, she lit a fire in the old stone hearth and watched the flames dance. She should have felt relieved. She was alone. No one to ask questions. No one to pry open the wounds she'd managed to hide so well. But just as the warmth began to seep into her bones, there was a knock at the door. She froze. No one knew she was here, not officially. Not even the lawyer who'd handled her grandfather's will had her arrival date. She crossed the room slowly, heart thudding. Through the frosted glass, she saw a tall figure standing on the porch, bundled in a coat, scarf pulled high. She opened the door a few inches. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, his eyes familiar in a way that made her stomach drop. "Hey, Max." She blinked. "Caleb." He nodded, tugging down his scarf. "Didn't think I'd see you again." "I didn't think you would either." There was a beat of silence between them, the kind heavy with years and unspoken words. "I heard you were back," he said. "Figured I'd stop by before the whole town started knocking." She stepped aside instinctively. "Come in. It's freezing." He hesitated for just a moment, then crossed the threshold. He looked older, sure, a few lines around his eyes, broader shoulders, but the same calm presence that used to steady her as a child was still there. "You look good," he said, his tone casual but eyes searching. "Different, but good." "I could say the same." She closed the door behind him. "I wasn't expecting anyone. I just got in. Didn't mean to startle you." He glanced at the snow globe still sitting on the table. "I see you found it." She nodded. He kept everything. That's who he was. A pause. Then Caleb stepped closer. "You really back for good? Or just passing through?" Maggie looked down at her boots, then at the fire. "I'm not sure yet." He gave a slow nod, like he understood the weight of indecision. "Well," he said gently, "some places, they wait for you, even if you're not sure you're ready." Their eyes met again, and this time, neither of them looked away. Chapter 2. Ghosts of Christmas Past. The morning came slowly, the pale winter light seeping in through lace curtains as Maggie stirred on the worn couch, wrapped in the quilt her grandmother had made long ago. Her first night back in Haven Bay hadn't exactly brought restful sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, had sounded like a whisper from the past. But the real weight had come not from the house, but from the man who'd stepped through its door. Caleb. Just saying his name in her mind made something twist in her chest. Last night had been brief, polite, even, but his eyes had held a dozen questions she wasn't ready to answer. She hadn't seen him in 10 years. Not since the day she left without a word, her bags packed, and her heart too bruised to speak. Now he was here again, and so was she. Dragging herself upright, Maggie made her way into the kitchen, flicked on the kettle, and leaned against the counter, listening to the quiet whistle of water heating. On the wall hung a calendar, last flipped in May. A tiny cross had been drawn over December 24th. Her grandfather had always circled holidays, even the small ones, especially Christmas. It had been his favorite time of year. The lights, the songs, the warmth of it all. It was how he kept the house alive after Maggie's mother passed. Now, the cottage felt like a time capsule. And the lighthouse? It felt like a tomb. Maggie took her tea into the sitting room and wandered back toward the lighthouse entrance. The door creaked as she opened it again. The spiral staircase still smelled of salt and cold metal. She climbed slowly, holding the banister as though anchoring herself to something steady. At the top, she stepped into the lamp room again and turned slowly in place, taking in every inch. The windows were streaked, but the view was still breathtaking. The horizon was draped in pale gold and blue, the ocean below a restless mirror. Her eyes drifted to the work table tucked into the corner, her grandfather's old workspace. It was cluttered with things, notes, tools, and small pieces of lighthouse equipment. But what caught her eye was the snow globe. It hadn't moved since yesterday, but now she noticed the inscription more clearly. Light always finds its way home. She traced the letters with a fingertip, her breath catching in her throat. This lighthouse was the last place she had felt truly known, and the first place she had felt truly abandoned. Her mind flickered back to a memory. She was 10, bundled in a red coat, watching as her mother strung lights along the railing of the lighthouse. Her grandfather held the ladder steady, laughing about how even the sea deserved a little sparkle. That night, they had lit the lamp and watched from the beach as the beam cut through the fog. She'd felt like magic was real that night, that God himself had wrapped them in something sacred. But that magic hadn't lasted. After her mother's death, Maggie's father unraveled, moving further and further away from faith, from family, and eventually from Maggie herself. It was her grandfather who raised her, gave her roots, and tried to anchor her soul. But even he couldn't stop her from leaving when it all became too much. A sharp knock echoed from below, breaking the silence. She descended quickly, finding Caleb on the porch again, this time holding a paper bag and 2 coffees. "I figured you hadn't been to Charlie's yet," he said. "Still makes the worst bagels in the county." Maggie smiled despite herself. "I could use the worst bagel in the county." They sat on the porch steps, wrapped in scarves and gloves, sipping coffee that was too hot and too bitter. The view of the ocean stretched out endlessly, just like it had all those years ago. "So," Caleb said, "how long are you staying?" Maggie shrugged. "Just until the paperwork clears. I'll probably sell the place." He nodded slowly, looking out at the water. "He wouldn't have wanted that, you know." She bristled. "It's not that simple. I didn't say it was. Just, this lighthouse, it meant something to him. To a lot of people here. I'm not responsible for other people's nostalgia," she said, a little too sharply. Caleb didn't flinch. "No, but maybe you're still part of it." She fell silent, the words settling like snow between them. After a pause, he reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small object wrapped in cloth. She opened it slowly. Inside was an old brass compass, the one her grandfather had always carried. She'd forgotten about it, but now the sight of it stirred something deep. "I thought you should have it," Caleb said. Maggie turned it in her hand. The needle still spun when she tilted it, but it always found north again. "He always said it knew its way better than he did." "Funny," Caleb said quietly. "He used to say that about you, too." She looked at him, startled. "He believed you'd come back," he added. "Said you just needed time." Her throat tightened, but she nodded. "I should go," he said, standing. "Snow's coming in this afternoon. Thanks for the bagel." "It's terrible," he said, grinning. She smiled. "Yeah, but it helps." After he left, Maggie stood on the porch a long time, watching as flakes began to drift lazily from the gray sky. The wind picked up, and the gulls cried overhead. Later that evening, back inside the Lighthouse cottage, she found herself rifling through the desk drawers in her grandfather's study. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, maybe just proof that he had still thought of her in those final years. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of faded maps, she found a wooden box with a small latch. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, of her as a child, playing on the beach, decorating the Christmas tree, curled up in her mother's lap. And in the corner of the box, wrapped in a handkerchief, was a tiny piece of paper. She unfolded it. "Maggie, if you ever find this, know that I never stopped hoping. Some lights go out for a time, but they always come back when it matters most. Pops." Maggie held the note to her chest and sat back on her heels. Tears streamed down her cheeks, not the kind that burned with regret, but the kind that washed something clean. He had waited, even when she hadn't deserved it. Even when she had convinced herself she was better off never looking back. Outside, the wind rustled the trees. The sea whispered at the edge of everything. And in that stillness, Maggie felt the first flicker of something she hadn't felt in years. Not guilt, not shame, but maybe, just maybe, grace. Chapter 3, The Town That Remembers. Maggie wasn't ready for the way the town opened its arms. It started with a quick walk to Charlie's cafe the next morning. She had barely pushed open the fogged-up glass door when a voice called from behind the counter. "Maggie Winters?" A woman stepped out from behind a tray of muffins, wiping her hands on a faded green apron. "Is that really you?" Maggie offered a cautious smile. "Hi, Georgia." Georgia Matthews, once the co-chair of every church potluck and president of the local PDA, looked exactly the same, just with more silver in her hair. She hurried over, arms wide. "Oh, honey, your grandfather talked about you like you were still 5 years old and chasing seagulls. I can't believe it's been so long. Come, what are you doing in town?" "I'm just here for a little while," Maggie said carefully, settling some things. "Well," Georgia said, handing her a hot cocoa without asking. "Your cocoa is on the house. Still take it with cinnamon?" Maggie blinked. "You remember that?" Sugar, Haven Bay remembers everything. It was true. As she made her way through town later that day, it became clear that Maggie Winters hadn't been forgotten. At the hardware store, Mr. Elkins insisted on loading her trunk with salt for the icy driveway. At the library, Ms. Dutt handed her a bag of books, just in case the wind keeps you inside. And every few feet, someone stopped her with a smile, a memory, or a gentle touch on the arm. Even the town smelled the same. That crisp salt air mixed with wood smoke, seaweed, and snow. The sense of home. And yet, a part of her felt out of place. Like she was watching a life she once belonged to, through the thick glass of memory. That afternoon, Maggie stood outside the community center, where a flurry of activity was buzzing around the front steps. Strings of Christmas lights dangled from ladders. Volunteers carried evergreen wreaths, and a giant sign out front read, "Christmas Eve by the Lighthouse. Join us." She hadn't known the event still happened. Caleb appeared, balancing a large storage bin full of lights. He looked up and saw her, his face lighting with a smile. "Well, if it isn't the town's prodigal daughter." Maggie crossed her arms, grinning. "Really leaning into that welcome home vibe, huh? You haven't even seen the mistletoe budget." She laughed, a real, full laugh, and it surprised her. Caleb set the box down and approached. "Want to help hang lights?" She hesitated. "I'm not exactly back." He nodded. "That's okay. Sometimes it takes a few days to admit you've come home." She helped anyway. For the next 2 hours, Maggie found herself working alongside neighbors she hadn't seen in a decade, hanging lights, fluffing garlands, sipping cider from styrofoam cups. The community center's warmth wasn't just from the heat inside. It was the laughter, the shared memories, the easy rhythm of people who had known each other forever. At one point, Georgia sidled up to her with a clipboard. "Your grandfather used to be the master of the lighthouse lighting ceremony," she said, pen tapping against her lip. "We were thinking, if you're here, maybe you could do the reading?" Maggie blinked. "Me? Only if you want to. It's tradition. And he left his journal for you, didn't he?" She nodded slowly, hand instinctively touching the folded letter in her coat pocket. Georgia smiled. "Then maybe you've got the words we all need this year." Later that night, Maggie returned to the lighthouse alone. Snow began to fall again, soft and silent. Inside, she lit the fire and pulled the wooden box from under the desk. One by one, she studied the photos again, this time not as someone visiting a memory, but someone trying to piece it together. There was one photo of her at age 11, standing on the spiral staircase, her arms wide like she was flying. Her grandfather stood behind her, his hand gently resting on the railing. He always made her feel safe in a world that no longer was. And another photo, tucked in the back, her with Caleb, maybe 17, standing outside the lighthouse with mugs in hand and snow in their hair. They were laughing, eyes bright. Back then, there was no sorrow yet. Just two kids wrapped in winter and promise. A knock at the door startled her. She opened it to find Caleb, holding a tin of gingerbread cookies. "These are a bribe," he said. "For what?" "For getting you to come back to the community center tomorrow. We're finishing decorations. Plus," he paused, "people want to see you, Mags. It means something that you're here." She looked at the tin, then at him. "You always make things sound so simple." "They aren't. But showing up, that's always step one." She stepped aside. "Come in." Fire's still warm. They settled in the small sitting room, the quiet of the lighthouse wrapping around them like a blanket. Caleb set the tin down and pulled off his gloves. "You know," he said, "you left without saying goodbye." Maggie stared into the fire. "I know. I looked for you for months. Wrote letters. Never got a response." "I couldn't," she said softly. "I didn't know how to be here anymore. After my mom died, everything fell apart. My dad." He shut down, and I felt like staying meant drowning. Caleb nodded. "I get that. I really do." They sat in silence for a long time. The fire cracked. Snow drifted past the windows. Then he said, "You weren't wrong to leave, Maggie. But maybe it's time to stop running." She turned toward him, eyes glistening. "I don't know if I can. I've built a whole life pretending this place didn't still live in me." He reached over and gently set the compass on the table. "Then maybe it's time to let it point you home." Chapter 4. The Letter in the Floorboards. Maggie didn't sleep much that night. After Caleb left, she sat by the fire long after the flames dimmed to orange coals. The compass he gave her sat on the coffee table, its brass casing gleaming in the firelight. She had tried not to get sentimental, tried to frame this visit as a chore, a goodbye wrapped in logistics. But Haven Bay was patient. And now it was whispering truths she had buried deep beneath her curated city life. By morning, the whisper had turned into a tug. She brewed coffee and pulled on a thick sweater before stepping into the small study off the main hallway. It had been her grandfather's sanctuary. Every tool in its place, nautical maps carefully stacked, a dusty Bible still open on the desk beside an old oil lamp. She sank into the chair and opened one of the desk drawers. Bills, notebooks, a pen that hadn't worked since 2012. In the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a stack of property tax receipts, she found a collection of letters bundled in string. Most were addressed to people in town. A few were to her. She untied the bundle and unfolded one. Asterisk Maggie, you'll find this one day. Maybe when the wind is strong and your soul finally stills. I hope you'll forgive me for not calling more, not pushing harder. I just wanted you to come home because you wanted to, not because you had to. You've always been my brightest light. Even when yours flickered, I never stopped believing you'd find your way. If you're reading this, welcome home. Pops asterisk. Tears came easily this time. Not the choking kind, but the kind that washed through gently, the way the ocean softened broken glass. She held the letter to her chest, the scent of old paper and cedar grounding her. Something shifted in her then. She stood and turned toward the far corner of the room, to the old floorboard beneath the window seat. She'd hidden things there once, as a child. Notes, candy wrappers, secrets she didn't want grown-ups to find. The board was still loose. She knelt and pried it up carefully. Inside was dust, a few pebbles, and a single envelope. Her name, written in her grandfather's neat handwriting, was on the front. No stamp, no return address. Just for when it matters. She opened it slowly. Asterisk Mags. If you're reading this, you've come back to the place that always had room for you. The world has its ways of pulling us away, making us forget who we were when we laughed without fear. I'm not leaving you with instructions. Just a question. What are you afraid of losing that you haven't already walked away from? Don't let grief make you a stranger to your own light. Pops asterisk. She sat there for a long time, the letter in her lap, the silence thick around her. The house creaked softly in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. Later that morning, Maggie headed into town again. This time, she didn't park near Main Street. She kept driving, up the hill toward the overlook, a place where the sea met the sky in endless gray-blue harmony. There, nestled into the hillside, stood the small cemetery where her grandfather had been laid to rest. She found his headstone easily. It was simple, stone gray, etched with Henry Pops Winters, Keeper of the Light, 1929 to 2023. She knelt, brushing off a dusting of snow. I got your letters, she whispered. The wind blew, carrying the scent of pine and salt. I came back, Pops, but I don't know what I'm doing here. A gull cried overhead, circling once before vanishing into the horizon. I think I lost something when I left. Maybe not just people. Maybe I lost who I was supposed to be. She closed her eyes, voice soft. But I want to remember. That afternoon, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Georgia again, this time holding a garment bag and a shoebox. Don't ask, she said, pushing past Maggie into the cottage. This belonged to your grandmother, and the town wants you to read at the Christmas Eve lighting. So you're going to wear something that makes you look like a Winters. Maggie opened the bag slowly. Inside was a long navy coat with gold buttons and a cream-colored scarf. It looked almost brand new, preserved like something sacred. She wore it every year, Georgia said, voice gentler now. And you look just like her. Maggie swallowed. I don't know if I can read in front of everyone. You read better than your grandfather did. He always got emotional halfway through. Maggie laughed quietly. That does sound like him. You're not him, Maggie. But you're his legacy. And people here need that light. She nodded. Not because she felt ready, but because something in her heart finally felt steady. That evening, she returned to the lighthouse. This time, she brought her journal. As snow began to fall again, she lit the lamp at the top of the tower, just like her grandfather had taught her. The old mechanism groaned, then hummed to life. The beam of light pierced through the night, cutting across the waves and sky like a sword of hope. She opened her journal and began to write. Asterisk December 22. Pops, I'm here, not just in body, but in spirit. I think I've been afraid of being seen for so long, afraid of failing, of not living up to you or Mom or who I thought I'd be. But this place doesn't ask for perfection, just presence. The lighthouse still stands. And maybe I do too. Asterisk. Back at the cottage, she curled up by the fire again. The compass rested on the table. The letter from the floorboard was tucked into her journal. The town had remembered her. And slowly, Maggie Winters was beginning to remember herself. Chapter 5. Christmas Lights and Silent Nights. The town was covered in snow, each street corner a reminder of the Christmases she'd once known, simple, sacred, unhurried. Haven Bay, with its quiet charm and unspoken traditions, was a place that seemed frozen in time. It had always felt like home, but now there was a new sense of purpose in the air. A longing, a healing, and Maggie felt it, too. She had spent the morning preparing for the evening's Christmas Eve service. As promised, she was going to read her grandfather's favorite passage. It was a tradition, one that had been passed down for generations. She didn't feel ready, but somehow it felt right. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her mind as she went through the motions. The light always finds its way home. Maggie stood in front of the full-length mirror in her room, adjusting the navy coat and fastening the gold buttons. The fabric felt warm against her skin, and as she gazed at her reflection, she could almost see her grandmother's face staring back at her. That same gentle smile, the same warm eyes. She had always wondered what it would be like her, to carry that quiet strength. The doorbell rang, snapping her from her thoughts. She looked up, then quickly pulled on her scarf and headed toward the door. When she opened it, Caleb stood there, a few inches taller than she remembered, his features softer but still the same. His dark eyes were warm, and he was holding a bundle of Christmas lights. "Thought I'd help with the final decorations," he said, stepping into the doorway. Maggie smiled. "Come in. I didn't expect to see you until later." "I figured you could use a hand," he said with a wink. "You're going to knock 'em dead with your reading tonight." She looked at him, her pulse quickening. Caleb had always known how to make her laugh, how to make her feel seen, even when she didn't deserve it. But tonight, something had shifted. It wasn't just the way he looked at her. It was the way she felt standing next to him. For the first time, it wasn't the ache of the past that defined their relationship. It was the possibility of what could be, something new, something whole. They spent the next hour hanging the lights, setting up the decorations in front of the cottage. When they finished, Caleb stepped back to admire their work. "It looks perfect," he said, looking over the sparkling lights that framed the doorway. "Your grandfather would be proud." Maggie's throat tightened, but she nodded. He always said this place wasn't just about the lighthouse. It was about the people. I think he was right. The evening was colder now, but there was a certain warmth in the air. The sound of the town's church bells rang out in the distance, announcing that it was almost time. "Are you ready?" Caleb asked. Maggie nodded, her heart racing. "I think so." The community center was packed by the time they arrived. The Christmas Eve service was the highlight of Haven Bay's year, a time when everyone gathered to share memories, light candles, and celebrate the season. The entire town had pitched in, decorating the room with wreaths, garlands, and candles. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, and soft Christmas carols played quietly in the background. Maggie made her way to the front, feeling the weight of every eye on her. She had avoided this for so long, the eyes of the people who remembered her, the ones who hadn't judged her for leaving. But tonight, they didn't look at her with expectation. They looked at her with hope, with love. Caleb stood beside her as the pastor made the opening announcement. The warm glow from the candles flickered in the room as the lights dimmed. Maggie could feel her heartbeat in her throat, and her palms were clammy. "Would you do the honor, Maggie?" the pastor asked, his voice kind. Maggie took a deep breath, nodded, and walked to the podium. She looked down at the small slip of paper with the passage her grandfather had written. The words seemed to shimmer in her mind, just as they had when he had spoken them aloud for the first time so many years ago. She adjusted the microphone and began. "The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of the shadow of death, a light has dawned." Her voice shook, but she steadied herself. She had to do this for him. For her. "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace." Maggie paused, taking in the room. People were listening, hanging on every word, their eyes soft with understanding. Of the greatness of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. As she finished the passage, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The words felt heavy, but they also felt like a release. She had shared the truth her grandfather had cherished, the truth she'd kept locked inside for so long. The room was still, the air filled with the sacredness of the moment. The light of the candles seemed to brighten, and for the first time in years, Maggie felt a deep sense of belonging. After the service, Maggie stood outside with Caleb. The night air had turned colder, but the warmth of the town's love surrounded them. "You did great," Caleb said, his voice gentle. "I think your grandfather would have been proud." Maggie smiled, feeling something in her chest loosen, as though the weight she had carried for so long had finally begun to fall away. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for being here." "Always," Caleb replied. "I'm not going anywhere." They stood in silence for a moment, the church bells ringing in the distance as snow began to fall once more, blanketing the town in a quiet, peaceful hush. Back at the lighthouse, Maggie lit the lamp once more. It was the last time she would light it for the year, and she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude as she watched the beam cut through the snow. She closed her eyes, listening to the soft hum of the lighthouse as it guided ships safely to shore. She knew now that her grandfather's light hadn't gone out. It had merely been waiting for her to return, to rediscover the warmth and strength that she had always carried within her. As the light of the lighthouse shone into the night, Maggie realized she wasn't just lighting the way for others. She was lighting the way for herself. Chapter 6. The Family Heirloom. The morning after the Christmas Eve service arrived quiet and hushed, with snow falling in thick, lazy flakes outside the lighthouse window. Maggie sat by the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her hands, still wrapped in the moment from the night before. Her reading had stirred something in the town, but more importantly, it had stirred something in her. She was no longer just visiting Haven Bay. She was part of it again. She'd spent most of the night unable to sleep, replaying snippets of conversations, flashes of memories, and the glow of candlelight on familiar faces. Somewhere between the flicker of the lighthouse and the fire in her heart, something had settled. Peace. Her eyes drifted to the wooden box she had moved from the study to the kitchen table. She hadn't opened it since finding the letter in the floorboards. There was more inside: photos, trinkets, small scraps of her grandfather's life. But there was also something heavy in the bottom that she hadn't looked at yet. She reached for it now, pulling back layers of tissue and cloth until her fingers touched wood, smooth and cool. She lifted it out carefully. It was a carved wooden case. Intricate. Handmade. The initials HW were engraved on the lid in brass. Maggie opened the case slowly, revealing a small, leather-bound journal and an object wrapped in faded linen. Her breath caught when she unwrapped it. It was a pocket watch. Gold, weathered, and elegant, with a chain that had long since dulled with age. The glass was cracked, but inside, the tiny hands still ticked softly. It was still working. Inside the lid of the case was a note, written in her grandfather's tight, familiar script. Asterisk, this belonged to my father and his father before him. It's been passed down not because of its value, but because of what it represents. Time is sacred, Mags. What you give it to is what your life becomes. Don't waste it. Don't run from it. When you're ready, wear it. And remember who you are. Asterisk. Her hands trembled as she held it. Not from cold, but from the weight of it all. This wasn't just an heirloom. It was a legacy. Later that day, Maggie drove into town. Christmas Day was always quieter in Haven Bay, with most businesses closed and families gathered in their living rooms exchanging simple gifts and warm embraces. But the community center was open. Only today, it was transformed into a small Christmas luncheon for those who had no one else to celebrate with. Georgia waved her over the moment she stepped inside. "I was hoping you'd come," she said, handing Maggie an apron. "We've got ham to serve, pies to plate, and coffee that needs refilling. You up for it?" Maggie smiled. "Put me to work." She slipped the pocket watch into her coat pocket, not ready to wear it openly, but not willing to leave it behind either. For the next 2 hours, she poured coffee, listened to stories from widows and widowers, handed out slices of cherry pie, and laughed more than she had in weeks. There was something sacred about it all: quiet generosity, shared smiles, and the slow, deliberate way Haven Bay did everything. At one point, she noticed Caleb talking with an older man in the corner. The man was showing him something, an old photograph, and both of them were laughing. Maggie's heart warmed at the sight. As the luncheon wrapped up, Caleb found her by the coat rack. "Hey," he said, gently bumping her shoulder. I've got something to show you. She raised a brow. Do I need gloves? He chuckled. No, but you might want boots. They walked down to the harbor, the snow now a soft flurry in the air. The water was still, reflecting the soft gray of the sky. Maggie followed him down a narrow path toward one of the old boathouses that had long been abandoned. I came down here earlier, he said, pushing open the creaky door. Figured I'd clear out some of the junk before it collapses. Inside, the air was damp and dusty, but in the back corner, something gleamed beneath a tarp. Caleb pulled it off, revealing a small, hand-carved wooden boat, child-sized, its paint peeling but still beautiful. Maggie gasped. Is that? He nodded. Your grandfather built it for you when you were 8. Said it was for explorations and brave adventures. You two used to sail it in the cove behind the lighthouse. She stepped closer, brushing her fingers over the wood. A faded name was still visible on the side, Firefly. I'd forgotten about this, she whispered. We spent hours in that thing. I know, Caleb said, smiling. He kept it in here all these years. Said someday you'd need reminding. She turned to him. Of what? That you've always been brave. You just forgot for a little while. Her throat tightened. Caleb pulled a folded note from his coat pocket. Found this taped to the side. Maggie opened it. Another message from her grandfather. Asterisk, Dear Mags. If you're reading this, it means you finally came home to the water, to the light, to yourself. This little boat carried your laughter. Now it carries your roots. Use it again someday. With your own family, maybe. But always remember, home isn't a place. It's a promise. And you are never alone. Asterisk. Pops. She held the note close, tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, but reverent. Then, softly, Caleb said, I don't know what you're planning after the new year, but if you're considering staying, Haven Bay has room. I have room. Maggie looked up at him, the weight of the pocket watch in her coat a quiet reminder. Time. Legacy. Choice. I don't have answers yet, she whispered. That's okay, Caleb said. You've got time. That night, Maggie stood by the lighthouse, looking out over the sea. She wore the pocket watch now, tucked safely into her coat, close to her heart. The wind had picked up, but it didn't chill her. Not anymore. Inside, she placed the carved boat on the mantel, alongside old photographs and the compass Caleb had given her. The lighthouse pulsed with warm light above her, and inside her chest, the same light had returned. She didn't need to make every decision today. She just needed to keep walking in the direction of peace and truth and legacy. The rest, she was learning, would come with time. Chapter 7. A Candle in the Window. The last few days of December moved slowly, like the gentle hush before a new year turned the page. Haven Bay settled into its post-Christmas quiet, the streets dusted in snow, the wreaths still hanging, and the scent of pine and chimney smoke lingering in the cold air. But inside Maggie's world, something had begun to stir. She was no longer drifting. Each morning began with lighting the fire in the hearth and watching the sea from the kitchen window. Each evening ended with her journal open, her thoughts spilling onto the page in a stream of rediscovery. She hadn't made any official decisions yet, but the idea of leaving Haven Bay felt less and less like a return to life, and more like a retreat from it. And something told her Pops knew that would happen all along. It was December 27th when Georgia stopped by again, this time holding a small parcel wrapped in linen and twine. It came from the county archive, she said as she stepped in. I put in a request weeks ago, before I even knew you'd be staying this long. Looks like they finally dug it up. Maggie accepted the parcel, untying the twine with careful fingers. Inside was a faded manila folder marked Haven Bay Founding Records. Property lineage, Lighthouse. Georgia watched her silently as Maggie leafed through the papers. It's all yours now, Georgia said softly. Officially, deeded and documented. The lighthouse, the cottage, everything. Maggie looked up, stunned. He left it all to me? Everything. He updated the will 5 years ago. Said he knew. Deep down, you'd come back when it mattered. Maggie's hands trembled slightly as she turned over a page to find a photo tucked between documents. It was her, around age 10, standing beside the lighthouse with her grandfather. He was kneeling, pointing to the top of the tower, while she laughed with her eyes closed to the wind. He had been teaching her how to light the beacon even then. He really believed I'd come back, she whispered. Georgia nodded, brushing a tear from the corner of her eye. He believed in that more than anything. That evening, Maggie stood in the lighthouse tower again. The sun had dipped behind the clouds, and the gray-blue ocean stretched endlessly below. Her hands moved automatically, checking the mechanisms, turning the crank, and lighting the beacon. The glow rose slowly, the old lamp casting its arc out across the waves like a warm breath in the cold. Downstairs, she found a candle in the windowsill. The same one her grandmother used to light each night leading up to the new year, an old family tradition, a symbol of hope, of welcome, of faith in what still lay ahead. She lit it without hesitation. Later, Caleb stopped by. He brought soup in a thermos and a lopsided loaf of bread he'd baked himself. "I'm no baker," he admitted, "but it's edible." "Mostly." Maggie laughed and gestured for him to come in. They ate by the fire, the warmth wrapping around them like a shared secret. "I heard about the lighthouse," Caleb said between spoonfuls. "You're the new keeper." She smiled, nodding. "I guess I am." "How does it feel?" She leaned back, the fire flickering in her eyes. "Like I'm finally standing still long enough to feel something real." Caleb tilted his head. "That's a rare thing." They were quiet for a while after that. Comfortable silence. Then Maggie said, "Do you remember the candle in the window?" He looked over. "Your grandmother used to light it every year. She said it was for the lost, so they'd know there was always a place for them here." Caleb nodded slowly. "I think a lot of people need that. Especially now." "I think I did too," Maggie said, almost to herself. The next day, Maggie returned to town for a walk. She didn't need anything from the store. She just wanted to feel the rhythm of Haven Bay beneath her feet. Along Main Street, she stopped to admire the window displays. One shop had a collection of old postcards, and in the center, she spotted one with a watercolor of the lighthouse, soft brushstrokes, and warm tones. Underneath it were the words, "Home is the light that remembers you." She bought it without hesitation. That evening, she pinned the postcard above the writing desk in her grandfather's study. The house had become her home now, not by deed, but by heart. And she was beginning to see it not just as a memory to protect, but as a story to continue. As she journaled that night, she wrote, "I don't know if I've made peace with the past, but I'm learning to live with it. And maybe that's enough for now." On December 30th, the townspeople gathered at the town square for the annual tree lighting farewell, a smaller event than Christmas Eve, but more intimate. It was Haven Bay's way of saying thank you to the year that had passed and lighting the way into what was to come. Maggie stood near the back, sipping cider and watching children chase each other through the snow. Georgia found her, bundled in a red coat and smiling. "Next year, I expect you up front," she teased. "We'll see," Maggie replied, but this time she meant maybe. Not no. The mayor gave a short speech. A choir sang softly in the background. And when the lights on the tree finally blinked to life, a hush fell over the crowd. Maggie found herself looking up, not just at the tree, but at the lighthouse in the distance. Its steady beam turned through the dark sky, a heartbeat of light across the horizon. She thought of Pops. She thought of what it meant to carry someone's legacy. And for the first time, she thought, maybe I can. Back at the cottage, she stood at the window where the candle still burned. She didn't blow it out. She simply stood beside it, watching it flicker, casting golden light across the quiet room. Tomorrow would be New Year's Eve. Another chapter. But tonight, she was exactly where she needed to be. Chapter 8, A Winter's Goodbye. New Year's Eve arrived with a stillness Maggie hadn't expected. The sky wore a heavy coat of silver, and frost patterned the window panes like lace. Most of Haven Bay slept in that morning, savoring the final hush before the coming of the new year. But Maggie was already awake. She sat on the window seat in the lighthouse cottage, wrapped in her grandfather's wool sweater, a mug of tea warming her hands. The candle still flickered beside her, its flame softer now. Like it, too, was preparing for a quiet farewell. Today, she would visit the cemetery. She'd avoided it all month, not out of fear, but because she didn't know what she would say. What words could possibly do justice to a man who had been lighthouse, compass, and anchor all at once? She slipped the pocket watch into her coat, pulled on her boots, and stepped into the snow. The small cemetery sat behind the chapel, nestled between two hillocks that overlooked the sea. Maggie's boots crunched against the frost-hardened ground as she approached the headstone. Simple, just the way he would have wanted it. Henry Wallace, beloved grandfather. Keep the light burning. Her breath caught in her throat. She knelt beside the grave, brushing a light dusting of snow from the base of the stone. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back," she whispered. "But I think I finally understand why you left me all those letters, all those breadcrumbs." The wind stirred gently through the bare trees, the only reply the soft sighing of pine needles nearby. "I wanted to leave. I thought running would make me whole. But it didn't. It just made me tired." She placed a hand on the cold stone. "But this place, you never gave up on me. And I won't give up on what you built." A gull cried in the distance, and Maggie looked up, blinking back tears. "I miss you," she said. "But I think I found you again. Not just in this lighthouse or in the letters, but in myself." She stood slowly, feeling lighter than she had when she arrived. A winter's goodbye wasn't about sorrow. It was about closure. Back in town, preparations were underway for the Haven Bay New Year's potluck, an annual event held in the community barn. Maggie had helped Georgia and a few others decorate the space earlier that week, stringing paper lanterns and hanging garlands made of pine and cranberries. As the sun dipped behind the snowy hills, the town began to gather. Inside the barn, a fire crackled in the stone hearth. Tables were filled with dishes passed down through generations: casseroles, sweet rolls, deviled eggs, hot cider, and pies of every flavor. Maggie arrived with a dish of her grandmother's cinnamon bread, the scent filling the air as she placed it among the others. Caleb greeted her with a smile that warmed more than just the room. "You made it," he said. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied. They took their seats at the long table, surrounded by laughter, music, and stories. People shared their favorite memories of the year, their quiet hopes for the next. Maggie listened, heart open, soaking in the beauty of people living, loving, and simply being. Halfway through the evening, Georgia clinked a glass and stood. "As most of you know," she began, "this year hasn't been easy for many of us. We've lost loved ones. We've faced challenges, but we've also gained something back." She looked directly at Maggie. "We've been reminded that the light doesn't die just because someone we love is no longer with us. It lives on, in stories, in traditions, in the lives we touch." Maggie felt the emotion rise in her chest. Georgia smiled and raised her glass. "To the light, may we always carry it forward." The barn echoed with glasses clinking, warm applause, and soft murmurs of agreement. "To the light," Maggie whispered. After dinner, the town moved outside to prepare for the midnight countdown. Children danced around with sparklers, and couples huddled under blankets with warm mugs. Snow began to fall again, silent and soft. Caleb joined Maggie near the fire pit, hands in his coat pockets. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Better than I've been in a long time." He hesitated. "So, are you staying?" Maggie looked toward the lighthouse, its beams sweeping across the sky in steady rhythm. "I think I am," she said, the words feeling like a promise. "There's something here I need to build. Maybe not exactly what my grandfather built, but something rooted in it. A life with light." Caleb's eyes softened. "That sounds like you." They stood together as the mayor began the countdown. 10-9. Maggie felt the pocket watch against her heart and remembered the letter. What you give your time to is what your life becomes. 8-7. She thought of the boat named Firefly, the candle in the window, the journal pages filled with truth, and the voice of her grandfather that lived inside her still. 6-5. She looked at Caleb, not just as a friend or a figure from her past, but as someone who had quietly stayed, held space for her to find her way back. 4-3. She smiled. 2-1. Happy New Year. Cheers erupted. Fireworks burst over the harbor, their lights scattering across the snow and water. The lighthouse stood tall behind it all, steady and strong. Maggie leaned into the warmth around her, not just from the fire or the people, but from the hope that burned within. Later that night, she returned to the cottage alone. She lit the candle once more, letting its flame glow into the early morning hours. Then she took the old key, the one to the lighthouse tower, and placed it on the writing desk. Tomorrow, she would begin making plans. Real ones. But tonight, she simply stood at the window, watching the candle burn. A goodbye had been spoken. A welcome had been received. And the light, once again, had found its way home. Chapter 9. The Letter He Left Behind. The first day of the new year broke with golden light spilling through frost-covered windows. Maggie stirred early, long before Haven Bay awakened. The cottage was quiet except for the soft tick of her grandfather's pocket watch on the mantel. She stepped barefoot into the study, drawn by a tug she couldn't explain. A candle burned low where she had left it. The journal lay open on the desk, as if waiting. But what caught her attention was the sliver of yellowed parchment peeking out from beneath the desk's top drawer, one she hadn't yet opened. Her breath hitched. Gently, she pulled it free. It was a letter, sealed in wax, addressed in her grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. To Maggie, to be opened when you're ready to come home, really home. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the paper. The ink had faded slightly, but every word pressed deep. Dear Mags, if you're reading this, then I suppose you've finally stopped running, or at least stopped running from yourself. That's all I ever hoped for. There's something about this old lighthouse that people don't understand. They think it's just a place, a building, but it isn't. It's a calling. A lighthouse doesn't chase ships. It stands still and shines. That's what you are too, a light, Maggie. And it's time you remembered. You have my name, my eyes, and my stubborn streak, but you also have my heart. You were always the one who saw beauty in broken things. And now you get to help rebuild this place, not just with tools and time, but with story, with grace, with forgiveness. Stay, if your heart whispers to. Leave, if it doesn't. But whatever you do, let it be from peace, not pain. And remember, the world needs steady lights more than ever. Keep it burning. Pops. Maggie pressed the paper to her chest, eyes stinging. He'd known. Somehow he'd always known. Later that morning, she called Georgia and asked her to meet at the lighthouse tower. The older woman arrived bundled in a thick gray coat, breath fogging in the cold. You all right? She asked as Maggie let her in. I think I'm finally getting there. Maggie led her up the spiral staircase, the sound of their boots echoing on the stone steps. When they reached the top, Maggie unlocked the control panel, flipped the main switch, and the beam slowly came to life, sweeping wide over the harbor, cutting through fog like a quiet promise. I read his last letter today, she said. He said the world needs steady lights. Georgia folded her arms, leaning on the rail. He was right. I want to do more with this place. Not just live here. I want it to be used again. Open. Alive. Georgia's eyes gleamed. You thinking what I think you're thinking? Maggie smiled. Community nights. Quiet retreats. A place for people to come and breathe. Maybe even writing workshops. Your grandfather would have loved that. I think he planted the idea before I ever realized it. They stood in silence a moment longer, looking out at the vast winter sea. That afternoon, Caleb arrived to help Maggie clear out the unused guest room. The space had once held her grandfather's fishing gear and a few old furniture pieces. They moved boxes, dusted off shelves, and discovered a bundle of Maggie's old sketchbooks buried in the corner. She flipped through them, stunned by the raw, untamed emotion captured in ink and graphite. I forgot I used to draw like this, she said softly. You were always creating, Caleb said, gently taking one of the sketches, a lighthouse beam cutting through a storm. Even when you didn't know what to say. I want to use that again. I want this whole place to be used again. He smiled. Sounds like you're building something real. I hope so. He hesitated, then asked, So, are you staying? Maggie looked at him, really looked at him, and let the truth rise without fear. I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. That evening, as twilight settled over Haven Bay, Maggie placed her grandfather's final letter into the Lighthouse journal. She added a page of her own underneath it. To whoever finds this next, you're not lost. You're searching, maybe, or healing, or hiding, but you're not alone. The light that brought you here hasn't gone out. It's just waiting for you to see it. Take your time. Rest here, then shine again. She closed the book gently and placed it back in the drawer. In the window, the candle still burned. In the tower, the light still turned. And inside Maggie's chest, a new kind of hope had begun to rise. Not loud or urgent, but steady. Like the sea. Like the beam of a lighthouse. Like home. Chapter 10, When the Storm Rolls In. The weather turned on the second week of January. Haven Bay, usually calm in winter, braced itself for a coastal storm unlike any seen in recent years. The local forecast warned of high winds, icy roads, and the possibility of power outages. But Maggie felt oddly at peace. She had known storms, not just in weather, but in life. And this time, she was rooted. She stood in the lighthouse tower, adjusting the beam settings with gloved hands. The wind had already started its song, a low whistle through the eaves, an old tune only seasoned keepers could appreciate. Pops would have had the firewood stacked high, the pantry stocked, and the generator fueled. And Maggie had done all the same. She had learned. She had become a keeper. That morning, she visited the market to gather a few extra supplies. Everyone in town moved with a purposeful urgency. Still, when they saw her, they smiled, nodded, greeted her like she belonged, because she did. Maggie bumped into Caleb near the canned goods. He was wearing his usual fleece jacket, hair slightly tousled from the wind. Prepping for the end of days, he joked, dropping another can into his basket. Just making sure I don't run out of tea and soup, she grinned. You holding up okay? Better than I imagined. Honestly, I kind of like storms now. He raised a brow. Really, they reveal things. Shake things up. Force you to see what's solid and what isn't. He looked at her with an expression that said he understood more than he let on. Be careful out there, he said. You too. By afternoon, the winds howled louder, rattling shutters and sweeping snow into frenzied spirals. Maggie lit the fireplace, boiled water for tea, and tucked blankets around the reading chair in the study. The storm tapped against the windows like a visitor who didn't know when to leave. She wasn't afraid. The light still turned above her. The candle still flickered beside her. And in her heart, she felt the words of Pops steadying her. You can't calm every storm, but you can be still in the middle of it. Around nightfall, the power flickered. Once, twice, then blinked out completely. Maggie moved instinctively, flipping on the backup lantern, checking the battery-powered radio, and starting the generator from the basement. Within minutes, the essentials hummed back to life. She returned to the tower to check on the beacon. Its rotation continued, slow and faithful, casting its arc through thick snowfall like a watchful eye. The wind roared against the tower windows, and for a moment, Maggie simply stood with her hands pressed to the glass, watching it dance across the sea. A memory came unbidden. She was 8 years old again, huddled under a quilt beside Pops as a thunderstorm rolled through Haven Bay. The power had gone out then, too. She remembered the sound of rain on the roof, the creak of the old cottage walls, and Pops saying, "Storms don't last. But you do." She smiled. By morning, the worst had passed. The town woke slowly, brushing off limbs, shoveling driveways, and checking on one another. Maggie bundled herself in layers and headed into the quiet town with her lantern, stopping by George's first. "Everything all right?" she asked after knocking twice. Georgia answered, hair in a frizz, but smiling. "Lost power but made it through. Coffee. Always." They sat at the tiny kitchen table, sipping instant coffee, watching steam rise and curl. "That storm could have shaken things," Georgia said. "It did," Maggie answered. "But not in a bad way." Georgia looked over. "You thinking about the future?" "I'm thinking it's time to start building one." Later that day, Maggie walked back to the lighthouse and sat at the desk once more. She opened her journal and wrote. "There was a time when every storm felt like the end. Now I see they're just turning points. Sometimes they wash things away, but sometimes they clear the way for something better. I didn't come back to escape. I came back to begin." She stared at the words for a moment, then underlined them. That night, she climbed the tower again. The sky had cleared, revealing stars scattered like diamonds over the ocean. The lighthouse beam turned in its slow rhythm, and below, the candles still burned in the window. She thought of her grandfather, of every soul who had looked to this light and found their way home. She wasn't afraid of storms anymore, because she knew now, she wasn't just surviving them. She was standing through them. Chapter 11, Echoes of the Past. Maggie hadn't meant to find the attic. It started with a loose floorboard in the hallway. One of the old wooden panels had shifted slightly, catching the heel of her boot as she walked past the linen closet. When she bent down to inspect it, her fingers brushed something unfamiliar, a small, iron hook embedded in the wood. She tugged. A soft creak echoed through the hallway as the panel lifted, revealing a narrow staircase, steep and dust-laden, that led upward into darkness. Her heart beat faster, not out of fear, but curiosity. This house, her grandfather's house, still held secrets. And maybe, just maybe, one of them was waiting for her. With a flashlight in hand and a scarf tied over her nose, Maggie climbed the attic stairs. Each step moaned beneath her weight, the air turning colder and staler as she ascended. The attic was surprisingly spacious. Exposed beams, a single round window letting in a shard of light, and dozens of boxes stacked along the walls. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight like snow caught in a golden wind. She opened the nearest box. Inside were old photographs, black and white images of the lighthouse, the town, and several she didn't recognize. One, however, stopped her cold. It was a photo of her grandfather, younger than she'd ever seen him, standing beside a woman with soft eyes and a quiet smile. On the back, in faded ink, Henry and Clara, summer of '58. Clara. The name was unfamiliar. She kept digging. There were more letters, faded newspaper clippings, a few journals wrapped in a silk scarf. One entry, dated 1960, read, "Clara wanted to leave. Said the light had become too heavy. I didn't know how to help her carry it. If she ever comes back, I'll be ready." Maggie sat back on her heels, stunned. Clara hadn't just been a friend. She had been something more. And for her grandfather, a quiet heartbreak he had never spoken of. And yet, he had stayed. He had remained faithful to his calling, to the lighthouse, to this town, carrying the light alone. Suddenly, the echoes of her own choices felt sharper, more meaningful. She had also run from the weight once. But now, like her grandfather had once resolved, she was choosing to stay. That evening, she brought the journal and photograph down to the study. She placed them gently next to her own journal, tracing the inked names with reverent fingers. Georgia arrived a few minutes later with hot soup and her usual intuition. "You found something," she said, setting the pot on the stove without needing to be told. Maggie nodded, sliding the photo across the table. Georgia looked down, eyebrows lifting. "Oh my, Clara, you knew her?" "Not well. She left before I was old enough to remember her clearly. But the story was always whispered. Some folks said she broke your grandfather's heart. Others said it was just a matter of timing. Either way, he never said a word. Why wouldn't he talk about it? Because some grief doesn't need retelling. It just becomes part of who we are." Maggie exhaled slowly. He loved her. I think he did. But he also loved this lighthouse, this town, and you. Georgia reached over, touching Maggie's hand. "And now you get to carry both the light and the stories forward." That night, Maggie wrote in her journal by candlelight. Love doesn't always end in wedding vows or happily ever afters. Sometimes, it's staying when you've been left. Sometimes, it's keeping the light on for someone who may never return. But that love, it shapes us. And maybe the echoes of the past aren't here to haunt us, but to show us the strength we come from. She placed her pen down and looked out the window. The lighthouse beams swept across the sky, illuminating snowflakes as they drifted in slow spirals. The house was silent, but her spirit was awake, humming with understanding, with legacy, with peace. The following morning, Maggie took the photo and the journal to the Haven Bay Heritage Hall, a small museum near the center of town where old artifacts were kept. She met with Mr. Whitaker, the curator, a gentle man with thin glasses and a genuine smile. "I think this belongs here," Maggie said, handing over the items. He opened the journal slowly, reverently. "Your grandfather was a quiet hero in this town." "He was more than that," Maggie replied. "He was a keeper. Of light. Of love. Of hope." Whitaker nodded. "Would you consider sharing his story? Maybe speak at our founders' event next month?" Maggie hesitated, heart fluttering. But then she smiled. "I'd be honored." As she walked back to the lighthouse, snow falling soft and steady around her, Maggie felt something settle in her chest. Closure. But not in the sense of something ending. Rather, something whole. The past had been honored. The present embraced. And the future, unwritten, but full of promise. She paused outside the lighthouse gate and turned to look at the tower rising above her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like a keeper. And the echoes of the past? They had led her home. Chapter 12, The Gathering. The air in Haven Bay tasted of salt and pine as January gave way to February. A light dusting of snow still coated the rooftops, but the town buzzed with the kind of anticipation that only came once a year, the Winter Founders Celebration. Georgia had cornered Maggie at the cafe a week earlier, holding a clipboard and wearing the unmistakable grin of someone with a plan. "You're on the schedule," she said matter-of-factly. Maggie blinked. "For what?" "The community talk, of course. Everyone's heard about you restoring the lighthouse, and now they want to hear the whole story." Pops, Clara, the attic letters, all of it. Maggie had nearly choked on her tea. But somehow, now, it didn't scare her. She knew her voice mattered. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to use it. The morning of the celebration dawned clear and cold, sunlight shimmering across the harbor like a blessing. The community center buzzed with neighbors, laughter, the clink of mugs and trays of cookies. Children darted between booths, old friends embraced, and music played low from the speakers overhead. Maggie arrived with her journal tucked beneath her arm and a nervous knot in her stomach. Caleb met her at the entrance, holding out a peppermint hot chocolate with a quiet smile. "For courage," he said. She took it with a grateful grin. "And maybe for warmth. You'll do great. You were made for this." His words, simple as they were, settled her nerves like warm light in a cold room. When her name was called, the crowd quieted. She stepped up to the small stage, heart fluttering. But as her eyes scanned the faces before her, George's, Caleb's, Mr. Whitaker's, and dozens of others who had become familiar over the past few months, she realized something. This wasn't a performance. It was a conversation with home. She spoke plainly, from the heart. She told them about the letter she'd found in her grandfather's desk, the journal in the attic, the picture of Clara, the storms, both the kind that howled outside and the ones that wrecked you from within. She spoke of loss, of running, of coming back, and of choosing to stay. "I thought I came back here to escape," she said, voice soft but steady. "But the truth is, I came back to heal. And this lighthouse, this town, you've given me more than I could have imagined." She paused, eyes shimmering with emotion. "My grandfather once told me the world doesn't need more noise. It needs steady lights. People who stay, who shine, who hold on when it's hard. And I think that's what Haven Bay is, a town of lights." When she stepped down from the stage, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was steady, like the heartbeat of a place that understood her. Later that evening, after most had gone home and the sun dipped behind the waves, Maggie walked down to the lighthouse with Caleb at her side. They didn't speak much, just walked. Together. When they reached the base of the tower, she turned to him. "It still amazes me. How much can change when you stop running?" He nodded. "You stopped running, and you started shining." Maggie smiled, the wind tugging gently at her scarf. "I think I'm just getting started." Inside, the cottage felt warmer than it ever had. She lit a candle on the window, just like Pops had done, and climbed the stairs to the tower once more. The beam rotated slowly, casting its watchful glow across the town. She stood there for a long time, arms folded against the cold, watching Haven Bay breathe below. It wasn't just a lighthouse anymore. It was a sanctuary, a gathering place, a beginning. And as the light turned, faithful and strong, Maggie knew that the story was no longer just about her. It was about every soul who had ever wandered, every heart that had ever hurt, every person still trying to find their way. And here, in this place of stone and wind and memory, the door would always remain open. Chapter 13, The Gift of Staying. The day after the celebration, Haven Bay fell into a rare kind of hush. Snowflakes drifted lazily from the sky, settling over rooftops and trees like lace. The lighthouse, tall and unmoved, stood against the backdrop of the gray winter sea, timeless, watching. Inside the cottage, Maggie moved slowly through her morning routine. Coffee, firewood, a glance through the frosted kitchen window to the sea beyond. She was learning to love the quiet. She was learning to stay. There was a knock at the door just after 9. When she opened it, Caleb stood there with a brown paper bag and a sheepish grin. "I brought cinnamon rolls," he said. "The good kind. From Ruby's." She laughed. "What's the occasion?" "Figured we could celebrate surviving yesterday." "You spoke like you'd been telling stories your whole life." "I kind of have," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I just didn't know anyone wanted to hear them." They sat in the sunroom with warm mugs and the scent of cinnamon filling the air. Snow fell in steady patterns outside the wide windows. Time slowed. Caleb reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something wrapped in flannel. "I was going to give this to you earlier, but it didn't feel like the right moment." Maggie took it gently, unfolding the soft cloth to reveal a small, handcrafted wooden carving, a lighthouse, with the initials HE etched into the base. She blinked. "Where did you get this?" "Your grandfather gave it to my dad years ago. Said it was a token for someone who would understand what it meant to keep the light on. My dad passed it to me, and now." He looked up, eyes warm. It's yours. Her throat tightened. I don't know what to say. Just don't put it in a drawer somewhere, he smiled. That light deserves to be seen. She nodded, cradling the tiny sculpture as if it were made of glass. Thank you. After he left, Maggie placed the lighthouse carving on the mantel. It sat beneath the portrait of Pops, weathered and strong, and beside the journal where she had written her own pages. She stared at it for a long time. The weight of it wasn't heavy. It was comforting. A reminder that staying was not about being stuck. It was about being rooted. Later that afternoon, Georgia came by with flyers for the new community program Maggie had proposed, a seasonal writing retreat hosted at the Lighthouse. You're really doing this, Georgia said, flipping through the pages. People are going to come from all over. Maggie shrugged, smiling. Maybe, maybe not. But I'm not doing it to impress anyone. I'm doing it because it feels right. Well, I've already signed up, and I don't even write, Georgia grinned. I just want the soup and the view. They both laughed. As the sun dipped low, Maggie climbed the tower one more time. The town was dusted in white, lights twinkling softly from windows and porches. She thought of all the times she'd tried to leave this place, physically, emotionally, spiritually. She thought of the cities she'd wandered through, the apartments she'd packed and unpacked, the ache of never quite belonging. And now, here she was, back where she'd started. Only this time, she wasn't the same. She was anchored, and the irony wasn't lost on her. She had found the future by embracing the past. She had found purpose not in moving on, but in staying. That night, she wrote in her journal, "There's a myth that says healing only happens when you leave. That in order to grow, you have to go far away. But I'm learning that sometimes, staying is the bravest thing you can do. To stay through the silence. To stay when it's hard. To stay when the world says you should chase something shinier. But roots, deep, quiet roots, they don't make noise. They just hold you when the wind comes." She paused, candlelight flickering over the page. Then she wrote one final line. "I didn't lose myself in Haven Bay. I found myself here." Outside, the lighthouse beam continued its steady rhythm. And inside, a young woman who had once been lost now stood still. Not because she had nothing to run toward, but because she had everything worth staying for. Chapter 14. The door she left open. The postcard came unexpectedly. A small rectangle of paper, soft at the edges, postmarked from Portland and tucked between utility bills and a catalog she never read. Maggie nearly missed it, until she saw the handwriting on the back. Slanted, graceful, familiar. She turned it over and read. Asterisk Maggie. I heard from someone in Haven Bay that the lighthouse is glowing again. I can't say how happy that makes me. He would have been proud. No, he is proud. Asterisk. If you're willing, I'd love to visit. Just once. To see what you've done. To say goodbye, maybe. Or hello. Clara. Asterisk. Maggie stood in the kitchen, breath caught in her throat, the memory of the attic journal flickering through her mind. Clara. The woman in the faded photo. The echo in her grandfather's story. She stared at the postcard for a long time, her fingers brushing the worn corners. And then she whispered aloud, "Yes. Come home." Clara arrived a week later. She stepped out of the old silver car, like someone carrying both history and hesitation. Her gray hair was pulled back neatly, her coat buttoned all the way up despite the gentle warmth of early February. Maggie waited by the gate of the lighthouse, heart thudding in her chest. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Clara's eyes softened. "You look like him." Maggie smiled, feeling tears build. "You look like someone I've been waiting to meet." They embraced, gently, like a bridge being rebuilt, slowly and intentionally. Inside the cottage, Clara walked quietly, running her hand along the wooden banister, pausing by the fireplace, studying the photographs on the mantel. "He never stopped loving this place," she said. "No," Maggie agreed. "And he never stopped loving you." Clara didn't reply right away. Then, softly, "He asked me to stay. I couldn't. I thought I had more to find. But in the end, I only found noise. He found peace." Maggie poured tea, the silence between them tender rather than tense. "Sometimes," Clara continued, "we leave doors open because we hope someone might walk back through. But life doesn't always wait for that." "He waited," Maggie said. "He just didn't talk about it." Clara nodded. "That sounds like him." They climbed the tower together. Slowly, with Clara gripping the rail, they reached the top, where the beam rotated in steady circles. Clara stood by the window, eyes shimmering. "I haven't been up here in 60 years. And yet, here you are." "I wanted to forget," Clara admitted. "But there's something about lighthouses, they don't let you forget. They shine even when no one's watching." Maggie placed a hand on her shoulder. "Maybe that's what love really is. Not about being seen, but about showing up, even when you're alone." Clara wiped at her eyes, laughing through a sniffle. "You're wiser than I was at your age. I just had a good teacher." They spent the afternoon looking through old photos, paging through Pop's journals, and eating soup from George's kitchen. Clara told stories Maggie had never heard. How Pop sang old war tunes while fixing radios, how he carved little ships for the children in town, how he left room at the table even after Clara had gone. As night fell, they stood on the porch together, watching the lighthouse cast its familiar glow over the sleepy harbor. Clara reached into her purse and pulled out a folded paper. "I found this," she said, "the day I left. I couldn't read it then. I was too angry, too sure of myself. But I've carried it ever since." She handed it to Maggie. The letter was addressed in her grandfather's careful handwriting. "To Clara, if she ever comes back." Maggie read it aloud. "Clara, I never asked you to stay because I wanted to trap you. I asked because I believed we were meant to build something here. Not perfect, not always easy, but real. If you're reading this, it means you came back. Or maybe you just wondered what I had to say. Know this, I never stopped hoping you'd return. And even if you didn't, I kept the light on. For you. For anyone who needed to find their way home. Love doesn't always mean staying together. Sometimes, it means loving even when apart. And if by some miracle you're standing in this place again, thank you. For the love we had. For the story we shared. Henry." By the end, Maggie's voice trembled. Clara reached for her hand. Both women quiet under the light that kept turning, slow, strong, steady. The next morning, Clara left before sunrise. Maggie walked her to the car, both wrapped in thick coats, breath puffing in the chill. "Thank you," Clara said, pressing Maggie's hands between her own. "No," Maggie whispered. "Thank you." Clara smiled, eyes bright. "Keep the light on, will you? Always." As the car disappeared down the coastal road, Maggie turned back toward the lighthouse. The door was still open behind her, and for the first time, she understood the beauty of that. An open door wasn't just an invitation for someone else. It was a declaration that love doesn't end. It simply leaves a light and a way back. Chapter 15, Full Circle. The sky over Haven Bay had shifted. The stormy gray of winter was softening, giving way to the quiet promise of spring. Snow melted in gentle streams along the cobblestone paths, revealing patches of earth ready to bloom again. The lighthouse stood, as it always had, casting its faithful beam across the sea, a symbol of what remained when everything else changed. Inside the tower, Maggie stood barefoot on the cold wooden floor, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise spill across the waves. Today was the last official day of winter. Tomorrow, she would welcome the first guests to the inaugural Haven Bay Lighthouse Riders Retreat, a gathering of strangers who, like her, were searching for healing, for home, or maybe just for a quiet place to write. It was more than she'd imagined just a few months ago. And yet, in many ways, it was exactly what her heart had been building toward all along. By mid-morning, Georgia arrived with a basket of homemade pastries, several name tags, and a clipboard that had clearly seen battle. "You ready?" she asked, already moving toward the kitchen. Maggie smiled. "As I'll ever be. I put you down to lead the first workshop. Just a light introduction. Finding your voice in a noisy world. Sound like you?" Maggie laughed. "That's literally my entire life's journey." "Well then," Georgia grinned, "these writers are in for a treat." The retreat guests trickled in throughout the afternoon, a quiet poet from upstate, a single mother writing a memoir, a retired professor finishing his first novel, and even a teenager working on her first fantasy series. They came with notebooks and nervous smiles, with stories tucked inside them like unopened letters. Maggie welcomed each one personally, not as a host, but as a fellow traveler, someone who understood what it meant to feel a little lost and a little found, all at the same time. That evening, they gathered in the lighthouse tower for the opening circle. Candles flickered against the stone walls. Outside, the sea murmured, soft and low. Maggie stood before them, the same journal in hand she had written in since her return. "I want to thank you all for being here," she began. "For trusting this place with your stories." She paused, looking around the circle, faces lit with expectation, hope, and a little fear. This lighthouse has stood for over 100 years. Through storms, through silence, through loss. And yet, it still shines. Her voice steadied. And so can you. She let the silence stretch, not uncomfortably, but reverently. The way silence wraps itself around something sacred. This week isn't about perfect grammar or best-selling plots. It's about light. The kind you carry. The kind you give away. The kind you learn to keep for yourself. After the session ended and the guests retired to their rooms, Maggie stayed behind in the tower. The room was empty, but it pulsed with something more. Legacy. Redemption. Peace. She sat down by the window, journal open on her lap. And she wrote, "Asterisk, you don't have to travel far to come full circle. Sometimes, the place you tried so hard to leave is the very place you're meant to rise from. Sometimes, you don't have to start over. You just have to start again, right where you are, asterisk." In the weeks that followed, the retreat bloomed into something more than Maggie expected. Guests left behind gratitude notes. One returned the next month to volunteer. A publisher requested a manuscript from the retired professor. And the teenager, eyes wide and bright, said she'd never felt so understood. The town of Haven Bay watched it all with quiet pride, as if they'd known all along that something beautiful had been waiting to grow here again. And at the center of it all, the lighthouse stood, steady and bright. Not flashy, not famous, but faithful. One evening, as dusk settled, Maggie stepped outside to find Caleb painting the lighthouse gate. He turned at her footsteps and smiled. "You're late," he teased. "Couldn't help it," she replied. Someone had the nerve to write a 10-page poem and wanted feedback. He handed her a brush. "No one tells you this," he said. "But sometimes, the love that lasts is the one that builds slowly." She dipped the brush in paint. "Like lighthouses?" "Exactly like lighthouses." Later, with the final brushstrokes drying in the cool air, Maggie stood by the open gate and looked out at the sea. The same sea that once called her away, now called her home. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't even searching. She was rooted, writing, loving, giving, shining. In the end, she learned that you don't need to escape the quiet to live a meaningful life. You just need to listen, to stay, to love deeply, to keep the door open and the light on. For others, yes, but also for yourself. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories aren't the ones shouted across mountains. They're the ones whispered at the edge of the sea. Dear listener, if this story touched your heart, let it remind you that you don't have to have it all figured out to begin again. Maybe your story is still unfolding, and maybe the next chapter starts not somewhere far away, but right where you're standing. Thank you for listening to Where the Lighthouse Stood. Leave a comment below telling us what your lighthouse is. Like the video, subscribe for more full-length CleanRomance audiobooks, and share this story with someone who needs a little light today.